A little under a year ago now, I took a look at Gintama's first live-action movie, and to my surprise, it was pretty good. Sure, its budget was non-existent, the CGI was god-awful, and the action scenes left a lot to be desired, but as a whole, as a fan of Gintama, it was a good watch. It really did capture the essence and character of Gintama, a series you wouldn't think would lend itself well to live action, given how weird it can be, but regardless, it was a commercial success, leading to, just 1 year later, in the August of 2018, Gintama 2, a sequel live-action movie, which we'll be diving into today, and is, in my opinion, even better than the first, despite still being a little jank in places. So with that being said, let's begin. First and foremost, let's talk about what this movie actually covers. Much like the first adaptation, you can see a distinct divide between the first and second halves of the movie. Part 1 is largely comedic, whereas Part 2 is much more grounded. In the first movie, Part 1 was an adaptation of episode 65, the Shogun's Golden Beetle episode, and Part 2 was an adaptation of the Benizakura arc. Whereas here, despite also having the same runtime of about 2 hours 10 minutes, it is considerably more packed. Part 1 is heavily based on the Shogun, adapting episodes 83 and 152, the Host Bar episode and the second half of the Barber arc respectively, whereas Part 2 focuses on an arc I think lends itself incredibly well to live action, the Shinsengumi Crisis arc. So with an additional 2 episodes being covered, this sequel is much more fast-paced, and like before, heavily relies on the fact you've actually seen Gintama before watching the movie. These adaptations would be incredibly confusing were you to watch it standalone, leading to the first movie having an abysmal critic score, since I highly doubt any of these critics actually read or watched Gintama. But anyway now, let's get into the movie itself. As mentioned, this movie excels at capturing the atmosphere and aesthetic of Gintama as a whole, with most of the actors from the first movie transitioning to this one as well. No complaints here, the casting and costume design is, like last time, fantastic. As well as our returning cast members, we also have a handful of new characters, namely Otose Sachan Yamazaki, Matsudara, the Shogun, and our 2 antagonists in Shinsengumi Crisis, Ito and Bansai, who again both look and feel fantastic. However, much like before, the budget, or lack thereof, is pretty apparent. It does feel a bit cheap and tacky at times, like the cast are playing cosplayers of the characters instead of the actual characters, but as a whole, the general aesthetic is incredibly authentic and is one of the best parts of the movie. Even with their limited resources, this movie is a fantastic example of doing a lot with not much, and that alongside actually sticking to the source material, unlike certain Hollywood adaptations, this movie perfectly captures the essence of Gintama. It's less of an adaptation into live action and more of just a direct conversion, since it feels pretty much the same as the original, which is all that I can ask for. Case in point, the Host Club episode is one of the most absurd, ridiculous episodes in all of Gintama, and here, yep, it sure is weird alright, and it's this authenticity which is what makes it work so well, with the only major change here being Katsura standing in as a hostess instead of Kyubei. I love the fact that they really did not play it safe when choosing what to adapt. This episode is wonderful but weird, even by anime standards, so having the balls to put it in live action, where traditional anime tropes look significantly more unnatural on real people, it's pretty commendable. For instance, the classic anime reaction noises and faces look incredibly out of place in live action, but again, I would much rather an adaptation that keeps entirely faithful to the source material than one, Death Note, that diverges away completely. Sure, some parts are slightly eye-rolling with just how over-exaggerated they are, but that doesn't make this part of the movie any less hilarious. In fact, in this instance, it makes it even funnier, something only an adaptation of a comedy manga could properly pull off. It puts a breath of fresh air into these old episodes, gives them a new life so we can enjoy them once again, like we're seeing it for the first time. It's in a weird grey area where it's a faithful adaptation, which is fundamentally the exact same as the source material, but it still feels somewhat original. Mostly because a lot of the jokes and parodies are in fact original to the movie, and not only fit seamlessly into the world of Gintama without feeling out of place at all, but are occasionally inclusions that I would have loved to have seen in the original, something incredibly uncommon to find in anime live actions. But anyway, I've said my piece on the host club part. It's fantastic, just as funny as the original, so with that we move on to the barber arc, which is more of the same, faithful to the original, hilarious, incredibly over-exaggerated, you get the point. It is interesting here how, in the anime, the Shogun getting his face pulled back is just taken for granted in animation because it's for comedic effect, but when seeing it in live action, I gotta say, it looks a whole lot more disturbing, and goes to show just how powerful animation is in making us accustomed to the weirdest stuff imaginable in anime. But with that, there's not really much to say about the barber arc. It's pretty short and fundamentally the exact same as the original, so with that, let's move on to the talking point of the movie, none other than the Shinsengumi crisis arc. One point I like over the first movie is just how fluidly and seamlessly it transitions from the comedy episodes to the main arc. Whereas in the first movie, one moment they're chasing the Golden Beetle and then almost immediately the Benizakura arc begins out of nowhere, here they're cleverly intertwined to make it feel like a much more natural progression. For instance, during the host club part, Hijikata leaves Okuta and it's instead then where he obtains the curse and we see Toshi for the first time. And likewise, during the barber part, it's instead then where Okuta and Hijikata have their conversation in the restaurant, instead of this all happening afterwards, self-contained, within the Shinsengumi crisis arc. It's hard to explain, so I'm sure you're still pretty confused by what I mean, but essentially, I commend the fact that all of the changes in this movie aren't for marketing purposes, or attracting a certain demographic, or just completely unnecessary. Instead, it's clear how much careful consideration went into the storyboarding and directing of this movie, again, keeping it faithful to the original. But anyway, let's get on to one of the key weaknesses of the first movie, the action scenes, which left a lot to be desired, but I'm glad to say, as a whole, this movie is a big step up. Again, it can look a bit tacky in places, like a bunch of media students choreographing their first fight scene by chucking in literally every single special effect they possibly can, but as a whole, it's good stuff with few exceptions, with some of the highlights being Okuta and Kagura's fight with the Shinsengumi on the train, Ito's fight against the Joai rebels, and Bansai's fight against the Onuwa Banshu, which is completely original to the movie and introduced his ability with his guitar strings to great effect. As mentioned with the comedy segments, this adaptation of Shinsengumi Crisis is likewise incredibly faithful. Hardly anything is left out, and the only noticeable changes are in order to fit the entire arc within the movie's runtime, without changing the core plot all too much. Unlike the Benizakura arc, which I feel is much more action-packed and full of energy, Shinsengumi Crisis feels much more bleak and somber. The original is both literally and figuratively dark, and I feel like this adaptation transfers this tone pretty well. In particular, Okuta's final lesson is one of the most memorable parts of the original, and they certainly did it justice in this adaptation. Although relatively short, it was fantastic nonetheless, and the same could be said about Kondo's speech. Now I know Japanese acting, infamously, does not have the best of reputations, to say the least, but here Yuya Yagira as Hijikata, and especially Nakamura Kankuro as Kondo, were sensational. Kondo's speech on the train genuinely made me just as emotional, if not more emotional than in the anime, again something you would not expect in a live action adaptation. As I've been saying over and over again, this movie is pretty faithful, so the only real changes here are, once again, the inclusion of Katsura, as well as Gengai for a bit, but mostly just for comic relief, which is all well and good, with the other major change being the final fight between Gitsuki and Bansai. Now, despite my praise of the action in this movie, this is, weirdly enough, in my opinion, the weakest fight scene of the bunch. It's just so slow. It's as overly edited as a Bollywood drama, not one single strike of the sword goes by without a slow-mo zoom in or some other breakaway from the action, and it just lacks any fluidity with long pauses between each action, and I really don't understand why. Sure, other action scenes had the occasional use of slow motion, but here it's non-stop. I'm not exaggerating when I say almost every single movement is in slow-mo. But all in all, apart from this fight scene, the other action scenes all have fantastic choreography and significantly better CGI than before. In fact, that's just a key takeaway for the entire movie. The same essence and presentation as the first movie, but just with a higher production quality. For the most part. Also, I know this is incredibly petty, but I don't like that they changed the setting of this fight from beside the train in the original to the middle of Edo in this adaptation. To me, the aesthetic of Central Edo just looks bizarre. Instead of the mixture of modern and historic buildings like in the original, it just looks like a generic sci-fi setting, and I'm not a huge fan of it. Especially considering they spent the time and money to go out of their way to have this fight happen in Edo in the first place. Gintoki was already at the train, why not just stick to the original scene and keep it the same? Surely that would have been easier, no? But anyway, I digress. This is nitpicking taken to the extreme, so with that, before talking about the ending, I want to quickly take some time to talk about the comedy parts of this arc, which are fantastic. Toshi in the original was hilarious, and the same can be said here. Most of the scenes are exactly the same, like Shinpachi and Hijikata's encounter on television, and Hijikata's meeting with Yorozora, as well as an original Evangelion parody with Hijikata as Shinji in order to reawaken him from being Toshi, which was comedy gold. Again, another scene I genuinely wish was in the original. Oh, and also, completely random side note, I love that within Yorozora they have the complete volumes of the Gintama manga in the bookshelf. Just a neat inclusion I picked up on, which I think was a nice little Easter egg. But anyway now, one character I've yet to talk about is our antagonist, Ito, played by Haruma Miura, who, fun fact, also played Eren in the terrible Attack on Titan live action, but the less said about that the better, because Ito is done incredibly well here. Again, I know I sound like a broken record, but it's the same as the original, as it should be, so there's not much to fault when it comes to the ending. It is incredibly cinematic, and looks visually amazing, leaving virtually no stone unturned when it comes to replicating the original, even including Ito's backstory, which I expected they would have left out to save time. And as a whole, apart from some questionable physics here and there, the Shinsengumi Crisis arc was ultimately much better than I was expecting, especially the ending duel between Hijikata and Ito, which perfectly replicated the tone and emotion of the original, ending out the movie on a high note. But with that, let's come to a bit of a conclusion. This movie is, in my opinion, a step above the first adaptation. Although they do both suffer from common issues, like occasional mediocre action scenes, some questionable acting here and there, bad CGI, and not many, but still a few pointless changes, especially in regard to the ending fight scenes of both movies, but at the same time, they both have common positives. They absolutely nail the aesthetic and character of Gintama. Even with the original scenes, they perfectly emulate Hideaki Sorachi's writing and sense of humour without feeling out of place. And in terms of just the pure comedy, the movie is pretty much faultless. Sure, it can appear a bit cheap and tacky, but it's charming and certainly does not make the movie any less funny. Like the Evangelion skit, for instance. Sure, it looks terrible, but that just makes it even better. As a whole, the key improvement over the first movie can be attributed to the fact that 1. It simply adapts better parts of the source material for me. I personally prefer the Shinsengumi Crisis arc over the Benizakura arc in the original, so the same applies here. 2. The action scenes, despite being a little rough around the edges, are still, as a whole, definitely an improvement over the first movie. And finally, in terms of the core structuring of the movie, it feels much more complete and well-rounded, whereas the first movie felt a little all over the place at times. But with that being said, obviously this movie is not a replacement for the original. It's good, no doubt, especially when compared with other anime live actions, but it does have its problems, albeit relatively minor, again, especially when compared with the train wrecks of other live-action adaptations. Would I recommend this movie to Gintama fans? Of course I would. It's enjoyable from start to finish, and I can see no reason why you would genuinely dislike this movie, unless you'd never seen Gintama in your life, because this adaptation does not lend itself well as a standalone movie. Funnily enough, the complete opposite problem of most Hollywood adaptations. I do know there's also a third Gintama live-action adaptation, being a short TV series on the Okita Mitsuba arc, and I was planning to include it in this video, but I can't find a decent version of it with English subtitles. So what can you do? And with that, I'll be back in the next video. See ya!